It was just another quiet afternoon when a homeless veteran sat outside a small store. His clothes were worn, his face weathered by the years, but his eyes still held something powerful, memories of a life lived in service. He didn't ask for help. He didn't want pity. All he needed was a place to sit, a moment of peace. The air was cool, and a few people walked by too busy to notice him, but then the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. A police officer, tall and stern, walked over to the veteran, his boots thudding against the pavement. "Hey you," the officer barked, "move along, you're not welcome here." The veteran looked up slowly, his face calm. He didn't say anything at first. He had been through enough to know when to speak and when to remain silent. "I'm not bothering anyone," he replied quietly, his voice low but steady. The officer, already annoyed, scoffed. "Lazy piece of garbage," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the veteran to hear. "Veterans like you are just a burden on society, always begging for handouts, but never contributing anything." A few people glanced over, but no one stepped forward. They kept walking, avoiding the scene. The veteran took a deep breath, trying to hold his emotions in check. "I served my country," the veteran said, his voice just a little firmer now. "I fought for this country." The officer snorted. "Yeah, sure you did," he said, rolling his eyes. "What are you doing here now, huh? Wasting space on the street. You're no hero." The veteran's face tightened for a moment. He wanted to explain, to tell the officer about his time in the military, about the sacrifices he made, but he didn't feel like it would make a difference. The officer was already so full of judgment. The officer's tone grew more mocking. "Go on, get out of here. I don't have time for you." As the veteran stayed seated, the officer moved forward, pushing aside a bag that was beside him, knocking it to the ground. His eyes glinted with annoyance. "You've got 5 seconds before I make you move," the officer warned. The veteran slowly gathered his things, feeling the weight of the officer's words in his chest, but instead of arguing, he simply stood up, taking his time, his movements deliberate, as if weighing each step. The officer stood there, watching as the veteran carefully gathered his few belongings. He didn't seem to care that the veteran moved slowly, that his hands trembled slightly. The officer's eyes were cold. He didn't see the man before him as someone who had once served, someone who had been a hero. To him this was just another person to push around. With a quick motion, the officer kicked a cardboard box that was near the veteran's feet. It slid across the pavement, scattering the contents: papers, a few old clothes, and a small worn-out photo album. "Get up," the officer shouted again, this time with more force. "You think you can just hang around here all day like a lazy bum? This is a public space, and you're making it look like a dump." The veteran, still calm, bent down slowly to pick up the items that had fallen, but the officer wasn't done. He stepped forward, pushing the veteran's things away. "You don't belong here, you're just a burden on the city," the officer spat. The veteran straightened up, his hands clenched slightly, but he didn't raise his voice. "I'm not hurting anyone, just let me be," he said softly, his eyes looking at the officer. The officer took a step back, shaking his head with a mocking grin. "Oh please, you served in some war, huh? And now look at you, sitting here begging for a handout. You think that gives you a free pass?" The veteran opened his mouth to speak, but the officer didn't let him finish. "You're just like the rest of them. You don't want help, you just want to cause trouble." The veteran's expression remained steady, but inside he felt the sting of the words. He wanted to tell the officer about his service, about the battles he fought, the friends he lost, the years he spent in a foreign land, but something told him that this officer wouldn't care. The officer, seeing the veteran's silence as weakness, went further. He leaned in close, his voice laced with disdain. "You people, you always think you're special because you wore a uniform. News flash, it doesn't matter now. All you're doing is wasting space and resources." The veteran took a deep breath, trying not to let the anger show. "I'm not asking for anything, just a little peace," he said, his voice quieter now, but the officer wasn't listening. "Peace? You're lucky I don't arrest you for loitering," he sneered, stepping back and pulling out his handcuffs. The veteran knew he could have resisted, could have tried to argue back, but what was the point? He had seen too much in his life to fight over something as small as this, and so, as the officer cuffed him, dragging him toward the patrol car, the veteran's heart felt heavier than the cuffs around his wrists. As the officer dragged the veteran toward the patrol car, the crowd of bystanders stood frozen, some unsure of what to do. A few whispered to each other, but none of them spoke up. They just watched as the man, who had once served his country, was treated like a criminal. The veteran walked quietly, his steps slow and deliberate. His wrists burned from the tight cuffs, but he didn't fight. He had learned long ago that sometimes, the best thing to do was stay calm, even when everything inside of him screamed for justice. As they reached the patrol car, the officer shoved the veteran against the car, his hands pressing firmly on his shoulders. "You think you're tough?" the officer sneered. "You think you're better than everyone else because you wore a uniform?" The veteran said nothing, but his eyes, tired and full of stories, met the officer's gaze. He had seen enough to know that some people wouldn't change, no matter what the truth was. But then, just as the officer was about to push him into the back seat, a woman stepped forward. Her voice was firm and loud enough to cut through the tension. "That man served," she said, pointing to the veteran. "He's a veteran. I know him. He served with my brother." The officer paused, his hand still on the veteran's shoulder, as the woman's words sank in. Her eyes were angry, but there was a softness in her voice as she spoke again. "I've seen him around before," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You think he's just a homeless man, but he's a hero. He fought for this country, just like so many others." The officer didn't respond. He just stood there looking at her, then at the veteran, then back at her. His eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, but he quickly shook it off. The veteran, still standing still, finally spoke. "I don't want any trouble," he said quietly. "I'm just asking for a little peace." The woman looked from the officer to the veteran, her frustration growing. "Why don't you let him explain? You're too quick to judge him. Maybe you should listen." But the officer, still not convinced, only shook his head. "I'm not listening to any of this. I'm arresting him for loitering. End of story." As the veteran was pushed into the car, he felt the sting of being misunderstood. He didn't expect the officer to understand the sacrifices he had made. He didn't expect anyone to. The woman watched in silence, as the patrol car pulled away, her face etched with anger and disbelief. She knew the officer's actions weren't right, but she also knew that sometimes, standing up for what was right, meant facing off against people who refused to listen. The courtroom was full of tension. As the case began, people had heard about the incident, and word had spread quickly. The public outcry was loud, and the veteran's arrest had caught the attention of the local media. It wasn't just about the arrest anymore. It was about the way the officer had treated a man who had served his country. It was about standing up for what was right. The officer stood at the front of the courtroom, his posture stiff and his eyes focused straight ahead. He looked confident, almost too confident. He still couldn't see what he had done wrong. He had done his job, after all. He had followed the law. That's what he told himself. The veteran stood beside his attorney, his hands clasped in front of him. His face was calm, but his eyes told a different story. They were filled with pain, frustration, and a deep sense of disappointment. He never wanted any of this to happen. All he wanted was to be left alone. But now, he had no choice but to face the consequences of someone else's actions. The judge, a middle-aged man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, called the court to order. His voice was calm and measured as he addressed the room. "We are here today to address the case of Officer Thompson and the arrest of Mr. John Harris, a veteran of the armed forces." The officer, still standing tall, looked at the judge, awaiting his turn to speak. The judge turned his gaze to the officer. "Officer Thompson, please explain your actions on the day in question," the judge said, his voice stern but not unkind. The officer cleared his throat and stood up straighter. "Your Honor, this man was loitering on public property. He was causing a disturbance, and when I asked him to leave, he didn't comply. I tried to reason with him, but he became belligerent, so I had no choice but to arrest him for loitering." The judge nodded, writing something down in his notebook. "And did you ask him if he needed help? Did you make any effort to understand his situation before making the arrest?" The officer hesitated for a moment. "Well, no, Your Honor. He didn't seem like he needed help. He was just sitting there, not doing anything. The judge looked at the officer for a long moment before turning to the veteran. "Mr. Harris, would you like to share your side of the story?" The veteran nodded slowly, his voice soft but clear. "I was just sitting there, Your Honor. I wasn't causing trouble. I served in the military for over 10 years. I've seen things that most people couldn't imagine. I came home, but life, it hasn't been easy. I wasn't asking for anything that day, just some space, some peace." The courtroom was silent as the veteran spoke. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The officer shifted uncomfortably, avoiding the veteran's gaze. "I don't want to be here," the veteran continued. "I don't want to fight anyone, but I don't think I deserve to be treated like that, like I was nothing." The judge nodded again, his face thoughtful. He turned to the officer once more. "Officer Thompson, do you have any evidence that Mr. Harris was doing anything illegal that day? Any proof that he was a danger or even disruptive?" The officer hesitated, and for the first time, doubt crossed his face. "Well, no, Your Honor, I didn't have any evidence, but I thought he was just another homeless man causing problems. It's not uncommon." The judge didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the officer for a long moment. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge finally spoke, his voice quiet, but firm. "Officer Thompson," he said, "you may have acted within the bounds of the law, but that doesn't mean you were right. The law isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding the people you're serving and protecting. It's about treating others with dignity, no matter who they are." The officer's face reddened, but he didn't say anything. He didn't have an answer to that. The room was tense as the judge paused, looking at the veteran, then at the officer. The silence seemed to stretch on forever. Everyone in the courtroom was waiting, wondering what would come next. The judge slowly stood up from his chair, adjusting his glasses as he cleared his throat. His voice when he spoke was calm and measured. "Officer Thompson, while your actions may have been within your legal rights, they were far from just," the judge began. "You treated a man who had served this country with disrespect and disdain, a man who fought for the freedoms that allow you to stand here today." The officer shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. "Mr. Harris," the judge continued, turning to the veteran, "you are a man who sacrificed much for this country. Your service is not something to be mocked or disregarded. You may have been down on your luck, but that does not strip away the fact that you are a hero." The veteran looked at the judge, his eyes tired but grateful. He had heard those words before, in moments of quiet reflection, but hearing them now, in this courtroom, felt different. The judge turned back to the officer. "The way you treated Mr. Harris was wrong. It was not the way we should treat those who have served this country regardless of their current circumstances." The officer's face turned red, and his jaw clenched. He opened his mouth to say something but quickly closed it again. The weight of the judge's words hung in the air, and he could find no words to defend himself. The judge took a moment, then spoke again. "Officer Thompson, this court finds you guilty of misconduct. Your behavior on that day was inappropriate, and your treatment of Mr. Harris was shameful." The courtroom was silent. The veteran stood still, his expression unreadable. The officer on the other hand looked stunned. His face paled, and he seemed to shrink back under the judge's gaze. However, the judge added, "I do not believe this should define you. This is a chance for you to learn and grow. You are being assigned to community service, specifically with veterans organizations, to help those who have served and to better understand their needs." The officer's eyes widened. "What?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You will work directly with veterans who need assistance," the judge said firmly. "You will witness firsthand the challenges they face. I hope this will help you see them as human beings, and not just as burdens." The officer looked around the courtroom, his mind racing. He had expected a reprimand, maybe even some sort of punishment. But this was unexpected, and it left him speechless. The judge turned to the veteran. "Mr. Harris, while you were wronged, I will not punish the officer any further. However, I hope you understand that justice has been served. You will receive support, and I will personally ensure that you are given the resources you need." The veteran nodded, his heart full of mixed emotions. It was more than he had expected. It wasn't about the officer's punishment. It was about the recognition the understanding that someone at least had seen him as more than just another homeless man. The judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the hearing. "Court is adjourned," he said, his voice final. The days following the trial were a whirlwind. The news of the verdict spread quickly, and the story became a topic of conversation all over town. People were surprised by the judge's decision to assign community service to Officer Thompson. They hadn't expected that kind of outcome, but many felt it was a necessary lesson. For the officer, the consequences of his actions were just beginning. He had spent years enforcing the law, but this was a different kind of punishment. Working with veterans was a humbling experience. He found himself sitting across from men and women who had seen things he could never imagine, who had fought battles he could never comprehend. Some of them had lost their homes, their families, and their health, all in the service of their country. At first, the officer had been resentful. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to listen to their stories. But slowly, something changed. He began to realize that these were not just homeless people or burdens on society. They were people with real histories, real struggles, and real pain. He saw the pride in their eyes, the dignity they carried, despite their circumstances. One day, as he sat in a group meeting with other veterans, an older man spoke up. His hands shook as he talked, but his voice was strong. "I lost my family when I came back from the war. They couldn't understand what I'd been through. I couldn't explain it to them. And then, I lost everything. My job, my home. But I never lost my pride, not completely." The officer listened, his heart heavy with the weight of the words. He had always thought he understood hardship, but now he saw it through the eyes of someone who had given up everything for a cause that many didn't even recognize. Back in town, the veteran, Mr. Harris, was adjusting to his new life. The support he had received from the community was overwhelming. People came forward, offering help, whether it was a place to stay, food, or just kind words. Slowly, he began to rebuild his life, piece by piece. He didn't want to be a burden on anyone, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. A few weeks later, the woman who had spoken up in the parking lot came to visit him. She had kept in touch with the veteran, checking on him and offering help whenever she could. They sat in a small cafe, talking about everything and nothing. She asked how he was doing, and he smiled. "I'm getting by," he said, though his eyes showed a hint of uncertainty. "It's not easy, but it's better. I'm starting to feel like I have a chance again." The woman nodded, her face soft with understanding. "I'm glad. You deserve to feel at peace." As for Officer Thompson, the change was undeniable. He wasn't the same man who had mocked the veteran on that street corner. He was quieter now, more reflective. He had a long way to go, but he was learning. And every day, he worked harder to make up for the mistakes he had made. One morning, the officer visited a local veterans shelter, a place where Mr. Harris had spent some time. He looked around the room, noticing the faces of people he had seen in passing. Now up close, he walked over to Mr. Harris, who was sitting at a table with a cup of coffee in front of him. The officer stood there for a moment, unsure of how to approach. Finally, he spoke. "I've been working with some of the guys here," the officer said, his voice softer than before. "I just wanted to apologize for what happened. I was wrong." Mr. Harris looked up at him, his face unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like the weight of the past few weeks hung between them, neither of them knowing how to bridge the gap. But then, after a long pause, Mr. Harris nodded. "It's all right," he said quietly. "We all make mistakes. It's what we do after that counts." The officer's eyes softened, and for the first time, he felt a genuine sense of respect for the man in front of him. He didn't expect forgiveness, but somehow, he knew he was being given a second chance. The veteran stood up, offering his hand. The officer hesitated for a moment, before shaking it, both men acknowledging that the road to redemption wasn't always clear, but it was worth walking.